I really think that the nonprofit sector's unique strengths are really based in the opportunity that the nonprofit sector has of being innovative and taking risks. And I think sometimes that's also our biggest weakness. But when the nonprofit sector can take big risks, there is a huge amount of potential for us to make big change. So an example of this is Apathy is Boring. So we're a small youth-led organization that works to get out the youth vote. And the really cool thing about what we're able to do in partnership with academics, in partnership with bigger organizations, is we can try things out. And we're young and dynamic, and we can be out there in the field. We are connected to the community, so we can try things out, and then those bigger organizations that we're connected to can take the things that work and implement them on a larger scale. So I think when innovation and risk happens, and also when we're connected with those circles of influence to make sure that our ideas can be amplified, it can be really powerful.
I think the biggest unique strength the sector has is that the organizations in the sector are created by passionate people who are trying to do something for a public benefit, so not for self-interest. So whether it's a sports organization to create an opportunity for children to participate in healthy activities, or an arts festival or a social service organization, every single one of them was founded by a group of passionate people that saw a need. And it wasn't about income and revenue and their own personal self-interest, and I think that's just an amazing framework for the nonprofit sector to operate in.
It shows just a different way to be organizationally, to exist when profit isn't the sole motive. And so different ways to think about impact, different ways to think about what's the value in the work you're doing beyond just the profit margin is something that I think we need to think more about, and I think the private sector is now trying to start thinking about, and hopefully the nonprofit sector has been thinking about that for a long time and can provide some leadership. So
I consider myself sort of mid-career nonprofit professional, and from that perspective I think that the people are the greatest strength. I've had the opportunity over the last 12 years to meet some amazing people, some amazing young people, some amazing leaders, and a bunch of people in between. So I think for me, there's no other sector that captures the passion, the interest, the values-based work.
I definitely think there are opportunities and challenges around our labor force. Lots of people in the nonprofit sector will be retiring in the next few years. In many subsectors, our salaries aren't as competitive, our pension plans and packages aren't as competitive, so trying to encourage younger people to become workers in the sector, I think will be a challenge going forward, and we need to address that.
I think it is easy for the nonprofit sector, certainly a challenge that the nonprofit sector has, is that it is easy because of funding models to kind of get stuck in our ways. And there's a dynamic around that where the nonprofit sector kind of tends to move slowly and tends to also rely on these bigger institutions that are quite bureaucratic and not very dynamic to guide the work that they're doing. So I think we can do great things when we are innovative, but if we, just like any industry, if we don't renew, and we don't take the opportunity to really figure out how we have impact, rather we just think about staying alive, and keeping the organization alive, then we tend to get stuck, and that's certainly a big challenge.
I see the intergenerational connections in this sector in a number of ways. I think certainly in our volunteer base, the nonprofit sector has volunteers right from students all the way to seniors. In fact, right now most of our volunteer work is done by youth and seniors, and not the people in the middle of the generations.
As younger people, we will often try to articulate and try to explain what we see, and it's totally misconstrued and misunderstood if we don't have the kind of that same language, if we don't have the same shared experiences with people that are older than us. So that's why it's so important for intergenerational learning and connections to happen, so that you can start to shift those perspectives and have those conversations.
To really encourage intergenerational engagement, the research shows that the number one thing we can do as adults, the number one thing we can do is we can ask young people to get involved. And really often, young people are hyper engaged in their own communities, in kind of these niche projects or with other young people, sort of peer projects, but they're not always connected to circles of influence. They're not always connected to traditional decision-making bodies. And that's really where the problem is. It's not a problem of young people not being engaged, it's a problem of young people and these traditional institutions not being linked. So the research really shows that 45% of young Canadians don't volunteer because nobody has ever asked them to.
So I think a lot of young people coming into the nonprofit sector have a ton of entrepreneurial energy and zest for reform and ideas for change. And I think that's a really great and useful source of energy and change for the sector. But I think at the same time there is a risk of miscommunication and a sense of the outgoing leaders feeling as though they are being trampled, their ideas may be being trampled by the new generation coming in. And I think there's a really great need for an intergenerational dialogue to exist somehow, because we've got on one hand a lot of experience in the sort of older generation of leaders that are outgoing, and a lot of reform and new ideas on the other. And if we just have reform and new ideas, then we'll probably repeat mistakes. And it's important to balance that energy with the wisdom and experience of the older generation, and we don't want to break that potential exchange of knowledge and institutional memory.
I think part of that would be a sector that organizationally lives out its values. I think it's a sector that's sustainable, that doesn't just rely on grant to grant to grant, so it can actually do long-term stuff. It's a sector that puts time and relationship at the kind of pinnacle of everything that's done. So all good social service work is based on strong human relationships, and strong human relationships take time to build. You can't build trust and understanding overnight. And so if we looked at all of our projects through that lens, is this building strong relationships between people? And are we spending the time to actually do it? I think we'll be more successful.
I have lots of aspirations for the sector. It's functional, it draws on the best of our talents, it's community driven, it partners well with private and public sector, and it is well resourced.
So I think an ideal nonprofit sector looks like a healthy sector that's resilient to change, whether it's funding changes, political changes, community changes, that has enough people and resources, financial and human resources, to get the work done that it needs to do. That it's really changing the changing the landscape in Ontario. It's building strong communities through health, through social services, through the arts. So I think a healthy nonprofit, the ideal nonprofit sector, is diverse, it's healthy, it's strong, it has people to support it, and it's across the province, in every nook and cranny, that everybody could actually recognize that, my life is better because of the nonprofit sector.
For me, what does the ideal sector look like? I would say the ideal not-for-profit sector is one that holds its roots dear and knows where its history comes from and has ways to celebrate long-time established organizations, and also is able to embrace the birth of new organizations and or the adaptation of older ones.
I think the ideal nonprofit sector will be achieved when we can speak in a common voice about certain things. Because there's so much diversity and, as I noted, it was a strength and a weakness, it makes it really difficult for us to actually speak together and support one another in achieving greater things. So even if it's around, for example, funding and ensuring that funding includes overhead and infrastructure costs. That's something that we can all benefit from, and if we were all speaking together on that, the impact would be huge.
So an ideal sector based on inclusivity and accessibility understands that you need to have different perspectives around the table, and a lot of times those perspectives come from different people, and it's about trust, it's about listening, and it's about really appreciating that diversity. And I think that if Ontario gets to a point where you have decision-making tables with government, with business, and with nonprofits, representatives of all three in a genuine, thoughtful conversation, really amazing stuff would happen.
I think the ways that we get to a stronger, healthier nonprofit sector are about continued volunteer engagement and the role for Canadians to become active participants in community building. It's resourcing adequately and appropriately so that agencies aren't running around with insufficient resources to do long-term planning and to actually build out towards their goals. We want agencies to end their work because it means they've delivered on healthy communities in Canada. So ideally, at one point, we don't even need the not-for-profit sector because we've done all the innovation and civic building that we need to really live out the Canadian dream.
One of my mentors, a minister in the United Church, had always said his dream was a program that would put students and retired people together because they both have lots of time on their hands and are not so invested in the system that they actually don't have so much to lose, so can actually be a lot more hands-on and involved in causes. And that would be an incredible space, a program that brought those two groups together around project work. So I think that is maybe part of the future, is creating those opportunities in a practical sense. Like I think just having forums and discussions and whatever is kind of useless. Maybe it's fun, but it's not that important. But actually getting people together around projects that they can make impact is a great way both to build the relationships and to do something good for the larger society.
I'm a big believer in understanding the patterns of relating, and that how we interact with each other are established many, many, many years ago and often carried forward into the future. And it's how we see and understand those patterns of relating that will really help us to change our actions and our habits in a way that will embrace the diversity and the adaptation and the capacity of the sector to renew and be self-organizing and generative in order to represent the interests and needs that the sector does, because it's critical.